If Regency women didn't wear underwear, what happened when they got their periods? First thing you need to know, nobody in polite Regency society said period or menstruation. That word existed in medical texts, but not in actual conversation. Women talked about their courses or their monthly courses, emphasizing the regularity rather than the blood. You'd hear, "I am unwell," "I am poorly," or "my turns have come." The linguistic gymnastics were impressive, anything to avoid saying what was actually happening. The entire social structure of the upper classes depended on pretending bodies didn't do messy things. Sweat, digestion, elimination, bleeding, all of it belonged to a private sphere that respectable people didn't acknowledge in mixed company. So menstruation got buried under layers of euphemism, discussed only with female relatives, your lady's maid, or a physician if it became a problem. But here's where it gets interesting. While polite society was doing verbal backflips to avoid mentioning periods, the medical establishment was obsessed with them. 18th and early 19th century medicine treated menstruation as the ultimate health barometer for women. Your courses were supposed to arrive regularly, flow moderately, and cause minimal disruption. Any deviation, too heavy, too light, too painful, absent without pregnancy, could be classified as an illness requiring intervention. The biggest threats were suppressed or obstructed courses. If your period didn't come and you weren't pregnant, doctors genuinely believed your body was backing up with toxic fluids that needed to flow. Medical guides warned that suppressed courses could cause hysteria, fainting, headaches, digestive problems, and a whole constellation of vague symptoms. The theory was that women's bodies needed proper flow and that any blockage created systemic chaos. The treatments ranged from sensible to absolutely deranged, such as rest and diet adjustments, warm baths, and trips to mineral spas, which sound lovely, but also bloodletting to redirect the flow, mercury-based medicines, strong purgatives, and various tonics that did more harm than good. The spa culture of places like Bath marketed itself heavily to women with irregular courses and related complaints. On the flip side, heavy bleeding was treated as dangerous flux. Too much flow was just as concerning as too little. However, medical theories are one thing. The actual day-to-day management is where the class system really shows up. Commercial disposable pads didn't exist yet. That's a later 19th century invention. So, the Regency women actually used homemade cloth pads, folded from linen, cotton, or flannel, washed and reused. Museum collections and historical accounts describe these kinds of fabric pads as widespread across Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. The question is how they stayed in place. This is where evidence gets a bit fuzzy for the exact Regency period, but the most likely system involved folded cloth placed in the crotch area, secured with tight drawers, ties, or pins attached to a band or undergarment. You'd change it as needed, wrap the soiled cloth discreetly, and send it to the laundry. Now here's what makes this complicated. Regency underwear was in transition. Some women wore drawers by the early 1800s, but not everyone did, and styles varied widely by class and personal preference. Many drawers were still crotchless, designed mainly for modesty when mounting a horse or climbing stairs. The layers of skirts provided concealment, which helped hide any accidents. But those same layers also meant that if you did leak, you were dealing with petticoats, chemises, and potentially your outer dress, all of which needed laundering. And laundering in the Regency wasn't like tossing things in a machine. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and required privacy. This is where the class divide becomes impossible to ignore. If you were a wealthy woman with a household staff, period management looked like this. Your lady's maid brought you folded linen cloths and a basin. She helped you change as needed. She discreetly wrapped soiled cloths and carried them away. She either laundered them herself or passed them to the laundry maid. The whole system ran on paid labor, creating a buffer of privacy for you. But here's what's wild about that privacy. You weren't actually private. Your maid knew everything. She knew when your courses started. She knew how heavy your flow was. She knew if you were in pain. She knew if your bleeding was irregular or if your courses stopped entirely. The intimate details of your menstrual cycle were monitored by someone who worked for you, but who you depended on completely for discretion. But it gets super interesting when you factor in the power dynamic. Your maid could gossip. She could tell other servants. If you were unmarried and your courses suddenly stopped, pregnancy rumors could destroy your reputation, even if the cause was illness or stress. You needed her loyalty, which meant maintaining the right balance of authority and favor. The relationship between a lady and her maid was built on mutual dependence, and menstruation was one of the most vulnerable points in that relationship. Now let's turn the table around. What about the servants themselves? What about the laundry maids, the scullery maids, the women doing the hardest physical labor in the household? They had periods too, but they had fewer cloth pads, less time to change them, more challenging laundry conditions, and no buffer of paid labor to create privacy. They were washing your menstrual cloths while managing their own periods with whatever scraps of fabric they could spare. They were hauling water, scrubbing floors, carrying coal, and doing physically demanding work while cramping and bleeding, and they couldn't afford to rest or take laudanum or spend the day in bed as their mistresses could. The class divide in period management is staggering. Wealthy women had discrete systems, multiple changes of clothes, servants handling the mess, and access to medical care if something went wrong. Poor women and working women were improvising with fewer resources, working through pain, and risking leaks and odor because they didn't have the luxury of rest or privacy. Even the laundry itself was classed. In wealthy households, soiled menstrual cloths got soaked, boiled, scrubbed, and dried out of sight, either by staff or sent to a laundress. In poorer families, fewer linens meant fewer options, and laundry facilities were shared or non-existent. Period management was always partly an economic story, especially before modern plumbing and cheap textiles. Here's another layer to this. The Bridgerton marriage market revolves entirely around fertility. Young women are evaluated as potential wives mainly based on their ability to produce heirs. The whole system runs on the assumption that these women are fertile and ready to start having children immediately after marriage. But the reality of fertility was being tracked by servants. If your courses were irregular, your maid knew. If they stopped, she knew. If you were bleeding heavily or in severe pain, she knew. The medical belief that regularity signaled health meant that your menstrual cycle was evidence of your value on the marriage market, and the people with the most direct evidence were the ones folding your bloody cloths. There's also this. Many married women in the Regency didn't menstruate monthly for long stretches of their adult lives. Pregnancy, postpartum recovery, and extended breastfeeding all suppress ovulation and menstruation. Historical records on family planning show that women used their courses as signals for fertility timing and pregnancy calculations, so the monthly courses could be interrupted for years at a time, depending on how many children a woman had and how she managed breastfeeding. The marriage market obsessed over fertility, but the lived experience of married women often included long intervals without periods, followed by the return of courses, followed by another pregnancy. The cycle repeated until menopause or death in childbirth, whichever came first. Here's how it would go if a woman were on her period in the Regency era. She wakes up and realizes her courses have started. She rings for her maid. The maid arrives with folded linen cloths and a basin of water. The woman might say, "My courses have come," or simply, "I am unwell today." The maid helps her manage the cloth, pins or ties it in place, and arranges her undergarments and skirts. If the woman is in pain, she might stay in bed. Use a hot brick wrapped in flannel against her abdomen, and possibly take a small dose of laudanum if the cramping is severe. The maid brings tea, manages visitors with excuses about headaches or fatigue, and quietly removes soiled cloths throughout the day. Those clothes get wrapped, taken to the laundry, soaked in cold water first to prevent staining, then scrubbed, boiled, and dried. The whole system operates with minimal comment, maximum discretion, and the understanding that this is private business handled by women. But if something seemed wrong, unusually heavy bleeding, courses that didn't arrive, extreme pain, that's when concern spiked. A physician might be consulted, remedies would be tried, the vocabulary of obstructed courses or immoderate flux would come out, and the treatments would begin. Dietary changes, rest, medicines, possibly bleeding or purging to restore balance. The irony is that the system was designed to make menstruation invisible to men and to polite society. Still, it required an entire infrastructure of female labor and medical surveillance to maintain that invisibility. Here's the part that really shows the contradiction at the heart of Regency society. Men were raised to believe that women were delicate, prone to illness, governed by their reproductive cycles, and in need of protection. Medical texts increasingly described menstruation as something that could disable women, render them irrational, or require them to withdraw from regular activity. This thinking gets more extreme later in the 19th century, but the intellectual foundation is being laid in the Regency period. At the same time, working-class women and servants were expected to keep functioning regardless of their cycles. They didn't get to rest, they didn't get laudanum, they didn't get the luxury of being poorly for a few days. The ideology of female fragility applied only to women whose class position allowed them to be fragile. Everyone else had to keep working. And the women managing the periods of wealthy ladies were often doing the hardest physical labor in the household, hauling water, scrubbing laundry, lifting heavy basins, while dealing with their own menstruation. The show gives us romance, scandal, and gorgeous costumes. It doesn't show you the maid carrying away bloody cloths. It doesn't show you the laundry work. It doesn't show you women pinning folded flannel into their drawers or worrying about leaks during a 5-hour ball. It doesn't show you the medical anxiety around suppressed courses or the class divide in who got to rest and who had to keep working. But all of that was happening. Behind every perfectly dressed debutante at every glittering event was a system of cloth, labor, euphemism, and medical surveillance. Menstruation in the Bridgerton era wasn't the curse it had been in medieval times, but it wasn't liberated either. It was managed, medicalized, and made invisible through the work of women who didn't have the luxury of pretending their bodies didn't exist. The Regency period sits at an interesting point in history where Enlightenment medicine is trying to understand women's bodies. However, it's still filtering everything through theories of flow and blockage and the need for regularity. So, the next time you watch a ballroom scene in Bridgerton, remember, someone's courses probably started that morning. Her maid knows. The laundry staff will know by evening, and she's spending the whole night hoping the folded cloth pinned into her drawers doesn't shift or leak while she's dancing with a duke.